My name is Dr. Karin Johnson, and I'm a sleep specialist at Bay State Medical Center in Springfield, Massachusetts. Today, we're going to talk about daylight savings time and standard time. And hopefully by the end of this presentation, we'll give you the data and information you need to know that permanent standard time is the best for our health. This presentation was put together in collaboration with Dr. Eric Herzog, myself, Dr. Elizabeth Klerman, and JP, the founder of SaveStandard Time. We hope by the end of this talk, you will have the information you need to make the decision to support permanent standard time. If you are a policymaker, we hope that you will ask for us to change, to end the changes between standard time and daylight savings time, but most importantly, to reject the calls to establish permanent daylight savings time and instead endorse and support bills that support permanent standard time. If you are a journalist, we encourage that more is written not just about the time change itself, but about the long-term effects of living on one time zone versus the other. If you are a healthcare provider or scientist, please encourage your medical and scientific communities to endorse permanent standard time, and other organization and community leaders as well. We encourage to endorse permanent standard time. And everyone else, it's really important to write to your politicians and policymakers to support this as well. There are many organizations that already support permanent standard time, including both scientific and medical, especially many of the sleep societies support permanent standard time, but also other areas such as the National Parents Teacher Association and the National Safety Council, and other areas, including the Association of Canadian Ergonomics, all endorse permanent standard time for many of the reasons that we will go into in this talk. We're going to cover first an introduction to what circadian rhythms are and why this is important, to the other issues below, including health, safety, crime, education, economy, energy, environment. And then we'll talk a little about where we stand in terms of the laws today. So first, for an introduction of circadian science. There are 3 clocks. The first is our social clock. This is what we live on, the time that is on our watch, phone, or computer. And then there is the sun time. This is the time that it actually is in the sky. So ideally, the sun is going to be overhead at noon when the social time is noon. And then finally, there's the circadian time, which is our own body clock time. And again, all 3 will be aligned if noon is when the sun is at the highest. Our time zones were designed to put the alignment at the midpoint of the standard time zone. Why this clock is important is because our circadian system controls many aspects of our body's physiology. It controls our sleep time and duration, controls hormones such as cortisol, melatonin, growth hormone, affects our heart and blood pressure function, our metabolism, including glucose control, affects our mood and alertness, which can affect both performance and safety, and affects judgment and risk assessment, among other things. And this time is, again, most set by our light exposure, especially from sunlight. Any circadian misalignment can occur when our body clock does not match with either social or sun time. So there are a number of different causes. People that do shift work or are experiencing jet lag or moving between time zones can have circadian misalignment. Being in daylight savings time can do this as well. And anytime there is misalignment from any cause, it affects our physiology. The amount of sleep we get is also important. Sleep loss, again, also affects our physiology. And there's many studies that show that being sleep deprived affects our overall health, our mental health, our alertness, again, affecting things like driving and performance at work and other places. It affects substance abuse with increased risks with sleep deprivation. We're more likely to do more risky behaviors and more violent behaviors if we're more sleep deprived. And when there's a combination of both circadian misalignment as well as sleep loss, these effects get amplified. We're going to move now on to understanding time zones. So time zones are defined by the amount of hours that they are offset from universal time, with Greenwich, England being basically at time zero. And each time zone is meant to be 1 hour in width, with the eastern and western edges being no more than 30 minutes misaligned from solar time. However, especially in the United States, because some parts of the country wanted to match time zones with others, especially many of the western edges of the time zone have been extended. And so that can lead to, even on standard time, those places on the western edges being up to about an hour misaligned from sun time. When we're on daylight savings time, these are shifted by even an additional hour from sun time. And so the western edges can be delayed about 2 hours behind instead of just the 1. And basically everyone else on the eastern edge is misaligned by an hour. So people think about flying, and typically when we fly, we adjust to our new time. However, changing time zones changing from standard time to daylight savings time is not like flying to the new time zone. When we fly, our sun exposure changes. And so that will then reset our circadian rhythm and move our body's clock along with the movement of the clock that's on our watch. However, with time change, we only are changing the clock, but we are not changing the relative position of the sun in the sky. And our bodies will not adjust. And one study that looked at this found that if we look at hormones, and specifically cortisol, which is one of our main circadian hormones, only shifts by 2 minutes with changing time changes and does not readjust. So we live on this permanent misalignment throughout the daylight savings time period. Another example of how sensitive our bodies are is a study that came out of Germany, and they looked for every 1 degree longitude difference, which is the equivalent of a 4 minutes time of change sun time, the midpoint of sleep moved linearly with that change. And so again, we don't need big time changes to have effects on our sleep. The other thing that time zone changes, and especially going to daylight savings time does, is it changes the time of the day that we get at light exposure. And light exposure that's increased in the evening moves our body's clocks even later than they already are. So that delays our body's melatonin, which we need to help sleep, and it leads us to stay up later. And then in the morning, especially if we aren't getting bright light, and if we've gotten that brighter light in the evening, it makes it harder to get up in the morning and increases our dependence on alarms. And this is going to worsen in the times of the year when it's darker outside. So studies of this that have looked at comparing the Eastern to Western time zones have estimated that being the equivalent of the 1 hour delayed with daylight savings time leads to about 19 minutes of average loss of sleep throughout the daylight savings time period. However, the effects are not even. If you have to get up by 7 a.m., whether it's for work or school, this leads to an average of 36 minutes per night loss. And we know that most Americans already have trouble getting up in the morning. Most need at least one alarm, and they don't like waking up to alarm. And if you need an alarm to wake up in time, it means you're not getting enough sleep in the sense of health, in the sense of being at your best and being the most productive, and at the sense of being safe, for example, in terms of having an increased risk of car accidents. So one common myth I hear, or misconception that I hear, is people who are in favor of daylight savings time think, I'm stay up late, don't like the mornings, so I want that light at night when I'm awake. However, as we talked about before, if we don't get that morning light, which is critical to setting our body's clock, our schedules shift even later, and that increases the misalignments. So night owls are actually at more risk from permanent daylight saving time than people with other schedules. They will have even harder time waking up in the morning and even harder time falling asleep on time, and then more at risk for getting sleep deprived. And so what this looks like on a map, when we were in pre-industrial times, whether you're a night owl or a morning lark or more an average person, your schedules would stay aligned with the time zone. However, when we don't get the same bright light exposure, the night owls already are shifted just naturally by their underlying tendency to be delayed by a couple of hours. And so similarly, if we're on daylight savings time, those night owls are already starting about 2 hours behind, and it will get even worse as you get that daylight savings time. So the other thing I mentioned is that those who have to get up before 7 a.m. are at particular risk. And this brings up the important concept of disparities. We know that there are sleep disparities in terms of the amount of sleep that people get between whites and non-whites and those with higher or lower socioeconomic standing. And one big factor is when you start work and how flexible your schedule is. If you can sleep in later and not have to get up early, you're going to be less affected by these forced and abnormal misalignments between sun time and social time. And so this is some data about the percentage of people that start work between midnight and 6 a.m. So that's about 10% of our population, but it's twice as likely if you are someone that has a lower mean hours age or if you are not white. And so these populations are going to be at increased risk and get increased negative effects from a permanent daylight savings time policy. So I want to shift to how do we study the effects of permanent daylight savings time? One set of information is from past trials. So daylight savings time has been tried and failed before, twice in the US, the most recent being in 1974, and it lasted a single winter. And it was stopped quickly, as this article points out, because there were 8 school-age children who were killed in accidents waiting for their bus stops in the dark. Other failed examples were in the UK, and then most recently in Russia, where they found increase in mood problems, including depression and suicide. And again, they were all ended with unpopularity. So one common thing we'll hear is people will get surveyed and asked, do you want winter or summertime? And that tends to lead people to say, I want summertime. But again, it's important to not think of standard time as, or daylight saving time is summertime and standard time is winter time. If they're going the whole year round, they have very different effects. Another way to study is look at the places that aren't using daylight savings time. So Arizona and Hawaii opted out of permanent standard time since the 1960s, and Indiana used to be mostly on permanent standard time before 2007, when it switched to the switching daylight savings time pattern. Another way to study daylight savings time is to look at the differences in the relationship to sun time. So for each location, they are a different amount misaligned. We do want to look at similar latitudes to have similar sunset times. And we can look at the distance that a place is from the time zone meridian. So if you're on standard time, the center of the time zone is going to be when the sun time matches the social time. And the more west we are, the more misaligned we're going to be in a direction towards what is the equivalent of permanent daylight savings time. And we can look for gradients and changes in differences in whatever outcome we are studying by using these differences. And so again, within a time zone, the western end is going to be more the equivalent of daylight savings time, and especially the western ends that have been gerrymandered to over an hour of misalignment. The other way is to look at other disorders that have circadian misalignment. So there are people that tend to have a natural pattern where they sleep in late, whether it's because of things like shift work or because their natural more night owl schedule. And so there's something called social jet lag, which is the difference between sleep timing on work days and free days. And the larger the difference, the more circadian misalignment that there is. And so we can compare people who don't have social jet lag or people that have a large amount of social jet lag and use it as a proxy for what the effects are of circadian misalignment is. We can also ask people just in general, are you more of a morning or evening person? And for people that have strong preferences in one direction or other, we can compare those differences and to people that don't have a preference and look for what effect circadian misalignment may have. What we can't use is the studies that only look at the acute effects of what happens in the days or weeks around a time zone change. What they show us is that there are acute disruptions and sleep deprivation in those periods, but they don't tell us what the chronic lasting effects would be if we were to go on permanent daylight savings time or permanent standard time. So we're going to move on to health and review some of the data that uses these methods to give us information. So first, the transitions. We do not like transitioning, and we are all for ending time change. We know these transitions, especially in the spring when people tend to lose more sleep, are associated with increased cardiovascular mortality, including heart attack, strokes, atrial fibrillation, increased car accidents, emergency room visits, mood disturbances and suicide, medical errors, missed medical appointments, and more acute sleep loss. But again, as we discussed before, this does not tell us what being on either standard time or daylight savings time will do in the long run. It only tells us what making those acute changes does. Some of the data that point to permanent daylight saving time being chronically harmful is these studies that again compare the western edges of the gerrymandered time zones that are basically the equivalent of being on daylight savings time compared to the eastern edges being on standard time. So these studies have shown that the western edges have increased risk of cancer, obesity, metabolic abnormalities like diabetes, and later and shorter sleep. One study that looked particularly at cancer found increased risk of cancer for every 5 degrees west, which is a 20-minute delay. So the full hour delay of daylight savings time would have effects that were 3 times larger than what we're seeing here. Liver cancer similarly had differences with 21% increase in cancer for every 1 hour of misalignment from the center of the time zone. And they found that certain populations were at increased risk for cancer. And again, this may have to do with some of the sleep disparities that we talked about before. Data from social jet lag research found that people with this type of circadian misalignment were more likely to do behaviors like smoke, drink more caffeine, consume more alcohol, and higher incidence of depression, anxiety, metabolic disorders, including obesity and diabetes, cancer, depression, anxiety disorders, cardiovascular problems, decreased life expectancy, and affected adolescents' cognitive performance and academic achievements as well. Specifically for obesity, those with social jet lag are more likely to be overweight and more likely to be obese. And so a 1 hour difference in social jet lag was associated with a 30% higher overweight and obesity prevalence. And these effects were the largest in those who had the early work schedules. So what do we know from sleep deprivation research? This is just a small number of points out of a large amount of research, but we know that there's increased cancer, obesity, increases in blood pressure, increases in heart disease, and dementia, increased risk of deaths. And then there are other issues like more medical errors and people working in the hospital, more car accidents. We know it affects the immune system, which is increasingly important as we go through a pandemic right now, and a lot of effects on the mood system as well. And with all these effects, CDC has considered sleep deprivation a national epidemic since 2014. And we know that being on daylight savings time increases the amount of sleep deprivation. So the cost of all these increased risks of disorders have been estimated to being over $2.3 billion per year just for a subset of obesity, diabetes, stroke, heart attack, and breast cancer, not including the effects of other disorders. And again, it's not surprising that we see these health effects. We know that permanent daylight savings time delays the clock, makes it harder to fall asleep, harder to wake up. And we know that any disorder that causes circadian misalignment that we study, whether it's people with shift work or delayed sleep phase or other disorders, we find these similar effects with. So we really encourage for health, permanent standard time is best. It's what aligns our social clock to our sun clock, minimizes the circadian disruption, which will improve our sleep duration and quality, and improve many issues from health down to productivity. So I want to talk about some of these other issues beyond health. Safety is a big concern over people when they think about permanent standard time and permanent daylight savings time. They are worried that if it's darker and the evening is earlier, that there'll be more risk of accidents. However, there are many other effects that come to play other than just light. We know that in the acute setting of having to go through twice-year time zone changes, we see an acute sleep deprivation that can lead to accidents. And we know that we'll get chronic sleep deprivation when we're on permanent daylight savings time. And these effects are also really important on the risk of accidents as well as the roadway visibility. Daylight savings time does make evenings darker, but it significantly makes mornings darker. And it's important to remember how late it can be dark in the winter. And so it can still be pitch dark in some parts of the country, and it'll be most parts of the country still at 8 a.m. And some parts of the country will still be dark at 9 a.m. And most schools and many people commuting are already on the road by this time. In fact, even though there is more light during commuting times in the evening with daylight savings time, if you look at the overall percentage of commuting hours, when you take both the morning and the light, permanent standard time has the largest percentage of time during commuting time that has some amount of light. Whereas if you're either on the switching pattern or on the permanent daylight savings time pattern, there's actually ends up being even more time in the dark, mostly because there's still some darkness in the evening, but there's even more darkness in the morning. And we know that motor vehicle accidents are the primary cause of accidental deaths in the US, but 70% of US pedestrian deaths occur in darkness, and 20% of those pedestrians who are killed are children. And more children are standing around at bus stops in the morning hours than they are in the afternoon. And drowsy driving is a really important reason for motor vehicle crashes. About 20 to 30% at least of regular crashes, and about 30 to 40% of major commercial crashes. And these are thought to be possibly underestimated. The other important thing to remember is the risk of motor vehicle crashes are highest in teenagers. And teenagers is another population that is most affected by time changes in circadian misalignment, because they already have that tendency to stay up late and sleep late. So they will become even more sleep deprived with daylight savings time and at more risk for drowsy driving, and likely increase their risk, even if it is more light in the evening. One study that showed what happened with traffic accidents around daylight savings time week did find an overall increase, but interestingly, it did see that the Western regions were more affected. So those who already had more circadian misalignment and thus more sleep deprivation were at increased risk than the Eastern regions. Moving on to crime. Crime is, again, another area that is commonly cited for why politicians think we should go to permanent daylight savings time. But they tend to all use a single study to make this claim. Rubio and others commonly claim that permanent daylight saving will reduce the number of robberies by 27%. This study that showed this had several problems. It said there was a 27% reduction in robberies during sunset hours, but it didn't consider all hours. It limited its look only at the days before and after daylight savings time, and it didn't consider the effects of the whole year. And it claims on light as being a factor, but the study actually didn't look at the light levels when crime occurred. They used an average sunset time over all the regions as opposed to local sunset times. And more importantly, what this data actually showed was that in the weeks before daylight savings time, there was a decrease, but then it started to increase before there was this very quick drop right on the day of daylight savings time change, but then it went back up. So overall, there was higher rate and a trend towards getting worse in daylight savings time than the period that was on standard time. Similarly, the murder rate that was happening during standard time was lower than what it was on permanent daylight savings time. But again, we really need full year data to know the full effect. So what data do we have? There is a website that's called Crime Data Explorer, and we can look up by county how much crime there is. And so one thing that we can find is that there are increases in crime throughout the daylight savings time period in basically every county. However, if you look up any of the Arizona or Hawaii counties, you don't see this. And so what this looks like is in these sort of winter months on either end, there's lower rates, and they go up in the months with standard time. So I took areas that were on similar latitudes as Arizona. So in New Mexico or Georgia, there's 3 or 4% increase risks in crime, whereas there was fairly negligible, 0.2, 0.6, 0.5% more crime in Arizona. So this suggests that there's something about being misaligned with the clock that is making people have more crime overall. That isn't just the acute light effects. And one of the factors might be juvenile crime. We know that most juvenile crime actually occurs before it's dark. And being on daylight savings time leads to more time after school where people are out. It also leads to adolescents being more sleep deprived. And again, that teenage years is one of the most at-risk periods for people being more affected by a delayed circadian misalignment than other people. And so this leads to increases in risk-taking behavior, substance abuse, impairs their judgment and decision-making ability. There are studies that show that kids that are sleep deprived as adolescents are more likely to become criminals when they are adult. So anything that we can do to reduce this will not only reduce juvenile crime, but should also help over the long run with crime in older people as well. Next, we're going to talk about education briefly. There's been a big movement and a lot of forward policy changes related to starting schools later. There's been lots of studies that show if we can start school later, that kids have less reliance on caffeine, reduced health risks, improve academic performance, and we meet school requirements. And this is an idea of moving the social schedule and activities we do more in line with especially these teenagers that also have a delayed clock. However, if we go to daylight savings time, we essentially reverse any benefits that we are getting from this. You'd have to, instead of starting schools at 8:30, start schools at 9:30 to get the same benefits. So permanent standard time really protects those start times in the winter, and it will make an improvement in the autumn and summer where we are on daylight savings time. So next, the economy. The studies that looked at comparing Eastern to Western time zones estimated that we can save the $2.3 billion in healthcare, but they also projected that the lost productivity from sleep deprived people is worth over $600 million, and that $4 million and almost a half dollars would be spent on lost work days. Additionally, people who are more sleep deprived and circadian misaligned were found to have lower per capita income and lower wages. And so conversely, if we can get more sleep at night and be more aligned, and this was from some of the start school later studies, that we can increase productivity by more than a year of added education, and we can increase earnings by more than 6 months of added education. And these benefits, by more aligning our school times with our social schedule and our sun times in these kids, or circadian rhythms in these kids, would lead to billions of dollars of added economic benefits that would grow for the additional years as these people get older. And this would be due not only to improved issues with health and obesity and suicide and mental health issues that weren't included in this could make those gains even more. So lastly, I want to talk about energy. Energy is one of the prime reasons why people say that we do daylight savings time. However, a lot of the data that suggested that permanent daylight savings time would be an energy saving measure is outdated. So one of the main studies was done by the US Department of Transportation in 1975 and cite that we would save about 1% of energy if we are on daylight savings time. And the problem is this study was done during the oil crisis. And as this article reports, there were a lot of confounding measures at that time. So for example, schools had to set their thermostats lower by 6 degrees, and hospitals and nursing homes had to set them lower by 10 degrees. And so these things really made the especially heating and cooling costs be underestimated. Additionally, since that time, air conditioning has become much more widely available. And so that has altered our electricity consumption. As well as light has become a cheaper source of energy. A second study that is commonly cited was a study that looked at what energy would be saved by extending daylight savings time for the 4-week period in November and March that eventually happened in 2007. And so this study estimated that there might be about 0.5% of savings per day, less savings in the southern states where there's more air conditioning, and that they had insufficient evidence to comment on other energy data such as gasoline consumption or traffic volume. However, the main problem of this study is they really only looked at the effects in that 4-week period. So the times a year when we need more heating and more cooling in the middle of the summer and the middle of the winter were not evaluated at all. Another study in California that was more recent in 2001 found that there was no estimated improvement in energy savings that varied from -2 to +1. Some more recent data suggests that we might actually save energy with permanent standard time. So when Indiana switched from permanent standard time to permanent daylight savings time, there was a great experiment to look at what happened to energy. And this study found that there was actually a 1% increase in residential electricity demand, and that it was mostly driven by heating and cooling, which makes sense. And that the greatest consumptions were seen in the late summer and autumn, and found even up to a 2 to 4% increase in the month of October. They estimated that Indiana households would be paying $9 million more per year since they switched to daylight savings time than they were when they're on standard time, and that this would lead to increased pollution. And thus, we also suggest the effects on climate change as well that will be seen with increased energy use. Australia had another natural experiment where daylight savings time was extended for 1 month during the Sydney Olympics. And they can compare it to other states in Australia that started the daylight savings time earlier. And in the states that had increased daylight savings time compared to those that didn't, they found higher energy consumption, especially in the morning hours. Other studies from Japan do suggest that going to permanent daylight saving will reduce household lighting costs, and that those would happen most in the north in the times between April and September. However, they thought that there'd be an overall increase in electricity consumption driven by heating and cooling. And so to make that a little bit more clear, let's look at how much energy is spent on these different things. So this is a little old in 2009, but 35% of energy, residential energy, is spent on appliances, electronics, and lighting, while 41% on heating and 6% on air conditioning. And as it gets hotter and we use more air conditioning, this percent is likely increasing. Also, it's important to remember that residential energy use is about 20% of energy, where transportation and other uses make even bigger amounts. And so while there may be benefits in one area like lighting, they can be way outweighed by heating and cooling, as well as transportation. And while there isn't good data that we can find on transportation, I would make the argument that people who are awake longer are more likely to be active in using energy than people that are sleeping. And we know that with daylight savings time and increased light in the evening, people are more likely to go out of their house and drive and go places. And so it makes sense that there would be an expectation for more gasoline use. In terms of the heating and cooling, why does it make a difference whether we're on one versus the other? So if we go from daylight savings time to standard time, we would save a little bit of evening heat on standard time. However, because it's colder in the mornings, if we're on daylight savings time, we have more time in the day that is cold that we need to heat, and thus the amount of energy we're going to use is even more. On the other side, if we are on standard time, we will have a little increase in the mornings that we need to use on cooling. However, we have a lot more cooling that we're going to need in the evenings. So finally, where do we set with the law? The Uniform Time Act was enacted in 1966. And this required all states to observe standard time by default, but allowed states to temporarily change to daylight savings time. It forbids going to permanent standard time, but it forbids permanent daylight saving time, but permits permanent standard time, and gives Department of Transportation oversight. And any states can opt out of daylight savings time immediately with the passage of a state law. And so Arizona and Hawaii have done this. It would take an act of Congress, though, to change the law to go to permanent daylight savings time. And again, Arizona and Hawaii, as well as the US territories, have opted out of this. So it is much easier for us to end time changes by just agreeing to go to permanent standard time, which can be done without an act of Congress. If you write to a senator about daylight savings time, you will typically get a form letter back that is often filled with incorrect evidence. Many cite the data about time change to support being on permanent daylight savings time. And hopefully, as we explain, this just is not true. We know that there is strong favor in polls for ending time changes. And there is scientific data that agrees with that. But there are three choices. One is the switching schedule, but one is permanent standard time, and one is permanent daylight savings time. And hopefully, as you've seen today, there are many arguments why permanent standard time is the best way. So I want to just reaffirm a few commonly asked questions. So daylight saving times, they make the days longer and the sunset later. But no, you're just changing where the clock is, but the days aren't any longer. The sun hasn't changed in the sky. And it's just an hour, so that doesn't have much effects. Hopefully, as we've shown, you see that even very small changes to our body's clock can lead to significant changes in the amount of sleep we lose, their circadian misalignment, and thus the health and other problems that happen with those small changes. And doesn't the additional morning sunlight exposure deprive sleep? No, most of us already have to use alarms and sleep past sunrise without a problem. But at night, getting that added night will make it harder for most of us to be able to fall asleep, and will shift our schedules later. And isn't artificial light exposure more impactful than sunlight? No, there are effects of both, and staying up with artificial light can shift our clock some, but it's not enough to get us to the right time change. And if anything, it can worsen the effects of daylight savings time misalignment if we are still getting light even later on our circadian schedule. So again, we ask you to support permanent standard time. This does require policy changes, but we can go to permanent standard time purely at a state level without an act of Congress. And it's important to get the word out that ending time change is not the same as going to permanent daylight savings time or permanent standard time. There is a big difference between those two options, and permanent standard time is the best option. For more information, there is many resources on many of these sleep society sites, as well as from SaveStandard Time has a great collection of information that is out there. And so thank you for listening to the talk today.